Hello all, my name is Elsa Soderstrom and I'm a rising junior at Middlebury, joint majoring in environmental studies and geology and minoring in global health. I'm glad to welcome you to another episode in our virtual exploration series called MIDDVantage, Careers in International Development. This series focuses on the field of international and global development and brings in some talented members of our Middlebury community who work on varying issues in a myriad of institutions. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Matt Sommerville. Matt's background is in conservation and wildlife and graduated from Middlebury with a BA in biology. He went on to get a PhD in behavioral economics of payment for ecosystem services at Imperial College London. Now, it was a little bit of a head scratcher when I first read his PhD, but he explained to me that on simpler terms, it's essentially the idea of paying someone to conserve natural resources. He gave me the example that New York City pays to conserve the Catskill Mountains, which is where they get their drinking water, rather than paying for an expensive purification system in their city. Today, Matt is Chief of Party of USAID's Tenure and Global Climate Change program implemented by Tetra Tech. He's based in Zambia and leads a multi-country project for USAID, focusing on the interactions between strengthening land and resource tenure and the success of climate change mitigation and adaptation goals. Matt has always been interested in learning about cultures different from his own, and is happy that his kids can grow up in an international school with a broad set of friends and new experiences. When the pandemic hit this spring, he and his family moved to Burlington for the time being, but he has plans to return to Zambia in early August. So thanks again, Matt, for being here. And I'm just gonna go through and ask you some questions about your career and how you got where you are and what you do. So we'll just go from there. But to start, I was thinking that you could just walk us through your career path after Middlebury and let us know if there's a certain experience or course that led you to where you are now.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot, Elsa. It's fun to sort of be here virtually and share my experiences and thoughts on, pathways and also sort of what I do and how it's relevant to maybe the future for other Middlebury graduates in the next 20 years. So, I graduated in 2002, shortly after 9/11. The world was a changing place. I just studied abroad before 9/11 in Madagascar. I didn't come out of Middlebury with any career or path in mind. At least I don't remember now what I was thinking at the time. But I do remember sort of recognizing the areas that I felt that I was weak in, that maybe I hadn't, focused on or learned the most at Middlebury or just in life. For example, public speaking, lecturing. At the time, I thought I might like to be a teacher. So I got jobs that were short-term in outdoor education and seasonal work in the forests and woods, working on those skills while having a good time and getting access to a lot of new experiences. And I think in that process, I, got put in touch with teams and mentors and people who are passionate about various issues and have tried to stay in response or in touch with them. And I guess that put me moving between California, Florida, Alaska, Switzerland, Madagascar, and then ultimately England. And I guess these times I was put in touch with founders of organizations, who became my partners in network. And, they built both on friendships that emerge from working closely together in your 20s, built on shared interest. And I think I've continued to cultivate these. For about 4 years after Middlebury, I did small jobs and took on anything really that would take me back to Madagascar, which is where I studied abroad. Never really backpacking around the world, but always trying to do something that, is, working and contributing. So I taught at a school in Switzerland for some time and ultimately resulted in doing a master's degree in the UK that was extremely international and connected me with 40 people from 30-something countries who are still a very deep part of my professional network. And sort of, as you mentioned, I continued on to that to work on a PhD in conservation and behavioral economics in Madagascar and the UK, which at the time I was 30, 8 years after Middlebury, left me underemployed, living on food stamps and in a small apartment outside of Burlington with a 2-year-old child. So, I guess that's to say that a career path and all this is not sort of a one-way directional professional journey, immediately rewarding, stable, or direct. But what that did did is, that was a little after Barack Obama came to presidency. And at the time, he made a large commitment to global development, climate change, and forests, which happened to be 3 areas that I'd been studying. I found out through the grapevine that someone I'd worked with in Madagascar, based on a Middlebury connection, was in Vermont, who had recently been evacuated from Madagascar as they'd gone underwent a coup, a crisis. I got in touch with him. He was working for, what was then considered a secretive company in Vermont on Church Street in Burlington that does work for the for USAID. Not secretive for any main reason other than that it's a major contractor for the US government. I got a 10-day consultancy to write a paper on climate change and forestry, and I then sort of parlayed that into writing a proposal for USAID, which was then funded. And then just within a few months, strictly by luck, I'd been deeply involved in $70 million worth of contract wins, having never done anything like that in the past. And while all types of wins and sort of contracts and grant proposals or group efforts, sometimes people end up getting the credit, and somehow I got the credit, or a disproportional amount of the credit. So that sort of just put into mind the fact of luck, being in the right place at the right time with a new administration that had made a large commitment to a field that, frankly, there weren't a lot of people working in at the time, and was able to sort of jump into that area. A few years later, the company was trying to find someone to work on land rights and climate change in Zambia and in Myanmar, shortly after the Burmese government flipped over and the National League for Democracy came into power, and they needed some folks to work on land rights and forestry. So they put me on that project, and 7 years later, I'm still working in Zambia. I'm working in 6 or 7 other countries, trying to make things work. And I guess as I was sort of reflecting on this, is that I think there have been sort of 5 things that have happened to me in the past 20 years, 3 of which happened to me at Middlebury in the last year and a half of being there. First thing is I won a Ron Brown scholarship for an unpaid internship my junior year to go back to Madagascar. And the person who I was put in touch there is now someone I've been working with for 10 years. So that relationship stuck. Middlebury used to have a place called the Center for Northern Studies where you do a J-term and live in the Northwoods near Wolcott, Vermont. And I went there for a weekend and happened to meet my wife, another Middlebury student. I also had a mentor, recently retired professor, Steve Trombulak, who advised me one point that, I asked, should I go for a double minor in something else where I'd have to go back and take an introductory course? And he said, nope, take whatever you're interested in, follow that, because nobody really cares what you graduated in. They care what you can do after the fact. And then deep into my senior year, I just happened to join a symposium that was going on at Bicentennial Hall. I think I went over there for some free food and got sat next to a doctor from Portland, Maine, who was a Doctors Without Borders doctor, who had cured the son of a chief in Western Zambia. And that person, the family of that doctor, were now my introduction to international schools in Switzerland and Zambia. And I still work with both the Zambian International School, the Swiss International School, and the Zambian chief who he'd worked with, 25, 30 years ago. So just to say that you never know when these opportunities that will sort of create a pathway come, and, be open to them and keep your connections.
Definitely worth it to pursue them too. Yeah. So let's talk about your position at Tetra Tech. What do you do on a daily basis, and what's something you're passionate about with your role?
Yeah, so the program that I started about a year and a half ago, coming off the Tenure and Global Climate Change program, it's called Integrated Land and Resource Governance, which I manage the global program across 7 countries from both a technical and a financial perspective. So I manage USAID money compliant with US donor requirements and all of the good intentioned and bureaucratic pieces that come along with that, and then translate that into doing good for people on the ground who could care less about different, regulations. So it's a bit of translation there. But I guess at the heart of it, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world don't have any documentation to the right to live on the land where they sleep or cultivate the land that they farm on. So the question at the end of the day is, how can you be expected to invest in sustainable solutions for a place that you don't have any recognized rights over? That you're not sure whether you could be pushed off by someone more powerful, whether a company, government, other person in your community. Why would you be expected to plant trees, to keep the trees that are currently on the land, et cetera? And that, that's a deep issue, the protection of property rights. It goes down to intellectual property. It goes down into physical property. And I think it's pretty clear to us, we don't keep a house that we're renting or that we just happen to be hanging out in nearly as well as we keep our own house. So I work on helping governments, helping people access rights through low-cost approaches built off smartphones. I work with a lot of technology and maps to take, the idea that only a specialist can draw a map anymore, or only a surveyor, licensed surveyor can do things. I work with government policy to help them recognize the role of low-cost documentation, and that there's other legitimate power sources like community-based organizations, civil society. And then I work with the private sector, and that's been an exciting new thing in the last couple years, sorry. And this has been a refocus of the current administration in the US. The private sector, these companies need to worry about the risks in their supply chains. I work with Pepsi, for example, to improve their integration of women's rights into, not even women's rights, but just to see women as a greater source of their supply chain. So that when they have a farmer, it's not just a so-called head of household, but it is the whole household. Or that they consider women in their trainings and as a member of their supply chain. I also work on land rights and forests with Hershey's and Lindt Chocolate, for example. Effectively, 10 years ago, these companies who buy a lot of raw commodities, they don't have necessarily their own farms for cocoa or for potato chips for Lay's. They buy from individuals on the ground. 10 years ago, they couldn't easily track where their products are coming from. This really improved dramatically, and now companies, have made pledges or have been caught on purpose or inadvertently of, growing cocoa, for example, in protected areas or purchasing from protected areas, and similarly, household farms using child labor. Their companies are making commitments to meeting these no child labor, zero deforestation commitments. And they could easily just say, oh, we found there's a problem, we're not going to buy from you anymore. Or we found you're cultivating in a protected area, sorry, you're not a supplier. But rather than just stopping to buy from risky farmers, one of the things that I like to do in our role is try to convince companies and how you can bring these farmers into the supply chain in an improved way. You can't just ignore folks. You can't ignore people who are growing in protected areas because, frankly, there's other companies that are not well known that are perfectly willing to buy beef from deforested cattle lands in Paraguay, or who are willing to buy cocoa from deforested areas. So trying to work with companies and certification companies to sort of, what can we do once we find a problem in our supply chain? So that's pretty exciting to try to, and then try to sort of map those along. So I do a lot of that type of work. I manage a team across these 7 countries of Zambia, Mozambique, Malawi, Liberia, Ghana, India, and Madagascar, and try to free them up to do impactful work, keep them on target, and then try to encourage cross-country learning. So the work that's happening in India with Pepsi, for example, has relevance to working with large forestry companies in Mozambique. And so it's really exciting. I'd say the most rewarding part is starting in a new country with a new program and making the relationships with government, local partners, team members, and that's sort of the fun thing. It's just more fun than signing paperwork and making sure that people are getting paid on time, which is also a piece of the.
How long does it take you to establish those relationships in new countries when you're expanding?
Yeah, it's funny. It takes a while, and you never really know at the beginning. I would say, it could take as little as 6 months. It could take a year or longer. I mean, I've been working in Zambia for 7 years, and I still feel our relationships deepening. One of the things about institutional relationships, whether it's with a company or a government, is it's almost always built on individuals, and individuals move on. We've had, people pass away, they get transferred up, they get transferred down. And so you're always, people talk about laying the groundwork. I think actually, if you're doing your job right, you're always laying the groundwork and, building those relationships and finding champions. And that's a fun thing too, because, a lot of the structures we work in are very hierarchical and are only accessible to older folks, whether men or women, or not accessible to sort of raw talent. I think the U.S., we bring a little more respect for seeing talent and then moving it quickly through the ranks. I think sometimes we have the ability to sort of identify and move at that level, whereas someone could theoretically otherwise sit at a low level, waiting for the right time. There's some rewarding parts about working on that and finding some real motivated counterparts in different countries.
Something you had mentioned to me earlier struck my attention. You said that by definition, international development's goal as a career is to go extinct. I was curious if during your time in Zambia, have you seen changes like that? Has it grown? Has it shrunk? Or other changes in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think the industry has shrunk so much. I mean, there's the development industry, from the time of Cold War to now is very different. It used to be that all this work or much of the work was done by people who, were in USAID and whose job was USAID. With the end of the Cold War, the whole system sort of was dismantled, and we decided, we've achieved the job. We sort of gutted the State Department. Then shortly thereafter, mid-90s, we started relying more on contractors. And that, led into unexpected response to terrorism and sort of the contractorization of U.S. government services, for better or worse. You hear the companies like Halliburton and Blackwater, and those, at least I did when I was in the 2000s. Nowadays, those institutions are, it's very much contractor-led or NGO-led. And so there's been a big change there. Our job, and we believe it as individuals, is to put ourselves out of business. At the same time, our job, whether you're working for WWF or, Tetra Tech, is to create more business for yourself. So how do you get more out of a potentially shrinking pool? I think there's an interesting piece. If you look at international development, you've got humanitarian assistance right after a war. For example, that type of assistance is not going away. It's also not necessarily what I do. Then you have maybe, eliminating poverty or some really specific goals. Once you get a population under a certain rate or, certain literacy, we've met our Millennium Development Goals. Great. Those things can be done. The thing that, I've sort of devoted my life to, which will be a need for the foreseeable future, is governance systems and making systems work for people, not just work for the elite, not just work for some people. And these areas, there's much more vested interests. It's the way I see it. Everybody wants there to be less malaria, less AIDS. They want people to go to school. That's just a matter of how do we deliver that service. But if you talk about a forest, does everybody want that area to be forest? Does everybody want there to be elephants in this particular area? Maybe not. Some people benefit from the timber. Some people benefit from the opening of agricultural land. So some of these other governance pieces, other people benefit from taxes. So the broader sort of, the day-to-day of government, of making institutions work has, that's the deeper challenge. It's also the thing that's harder to get us to invest in, because you can't put that on a Save the Children, logo. Get a functioning tax system or whatever is not as sexy for donors. And as a result, we have seen donors drop out quite a bit. In Zambia, I've seen the closure of a number of embassies, a number of organizations, just because it's considered like, hey, it's a middle income country now. And frankly, Zambia is on its way to becoming a middle income country. But I think the bigger challenge that I see now is that the speed of change is enormously different between urban and rural areas, between the haves and the have-nots. And it's the same, what would you say, dynamic that you're seeing in the US that creates tension in the US in some ways, is that people who don't have a lot, even if they have more than they had yesterday, see what people who do have, and it's a lot more. So the rate at which things are changing is changed so much. And, when I first started working, there were no cell phones. I would go into the bush for 2, 3 months, 6 months, and I'd come out and there'd be no contact. And that just doesn't happen anymore. I'm sort of sad. I sort of feel like I was part of the last maybe generation that had that. We had landlines at Middlebury and, whiteboards. Y'all might still have whiteboards, but, it's a nostalgia. There's pros and cons. But yeah, 20 years ago in Antananarivo, Madagascar, you couldn't get a microwave if you wanted. Now, the new iPhone is in country with hours of release in the US. Yet the people who my friends and people I worked with in the bush, they've seen almost no change. They're still wearing the same T-shirt that was given to them in 2002 by, the former president. And so that's the harder thing for me to see. I think people can become more and more invisible. If you go online and you see, the development in Lusaka where I live, we have a few Pizza Huts, we have KFC, we have all these indicators of development on one scale, but just 5 miles out, you see nothing. So, you can't think the job is over just because of an aggregate indicator. But it becomes a challenge to sell that to the American people, when the average income in Zambia is not too far below the lower incomes in some of our states in the South. So I understand it.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. You touched on this a little bit, but how is your work in development consulting sector differentiated from nonprofit and governmental work? And do you feel like you're all working toward the same goals? Or are there different competing motives there?
Yeah. There are goals. I think there's goals everybody has as an individual and as an organization. And everybody sort of has their different approach to it. Most countries that we work in, they have national development strategies, specific government departments and programs, and then U.S. government goals. I try not to, working in a company, in a consulting firm effectively, our goals are aligned with whatever our client says, which is the U.S. government. And, for the most part, almost always sort of, I believe in the end product of what we're trying to get to, it works. Some of the nonprofits, they have more of their own goals, and I wouldn't say they're necessarily better or worse. They have a different way of getting to them. As an extension of, the State Department and USAID, we sort of use government institutions maybe to a larger degree than some of the NGOs who might start immediately at a different level. So it overlaps. People have different groups, and it also depends on the project activity you're working on. On the one hand, from a contractor perspective, of development consulting, I like it because we have a project. We make sure we deliver on those goals in the short term. The NGOs, if you want to call them that, they might have a bigger vision. They have maybe a bigger thought about sustainability. So they're thinking maybe about past the life cycle of our project, which is 5 years, or sometimes more. But I think sometimes that leads them to sort of look more at their own needs, their own brand, their own vision. Whereas from the day my project is won, I'm thinking about how to achieve the goals that are set out. So I actually personally like it. Mm-hmm. But I think it might be a false dichotomy between sort of the nonprofit versus development consulting. At the end of the day, there's projects that we decide not to take any fee or income off of. and any NGO will take fee. They'll take profit. It's just they don't deliver that profit to shareholders. So a WWF or I don't know, Save the Children or whoever, they would take a profit. They do take profit. They just reinvest it in their own work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those activities, they have a different set of indirect costs. They have a different set of fundraising activities and things going on. So I think the reality is any large organization is part of an industry.
Right.
They have their strengths and their weaknesses. You know, it's, I guess in a nonprofit, you might be a little more, or an NGO, you know, you might have a more direct sort of vision towards a strictly development goal. But as a consulting company, I think, you know, the goals of any of our given projects are almost always, you know, noble, I guess, in that respect, or, you know, at least all the ones I've worked in on land rights and environment. And if they might be a little bit misguided, and there are a few that are, then you work for a number of years to bridge that gap and move it towards, because it's useful. You know, at the best, we're sort of bridging the gap between needs on the ground and the bigger picture issues. So, and at our work, we're just a cog in the wheel, you know, so that, you know, someone can say, oh, we spent X amount of money to solve this problem. But I think usually we are, you know, as a whole going towards an impact and trying at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, like your work might be more tangible then if it's 5-year term rather than a broad, you know, long goal.
Yeah, you hope so. You definitely hope so. But, you know, everybody's trying to plug away, and the coordination issue is definitely a challenge. I mean, when you're working for a nonprofit or a development practitioner, you sort of have to realize that as an institution, in many cases, you're a guest within a country. Mm-hmm. And so there's a bit of a balance there. And, you know, I try to use that, I guess, to our benefit and to, you know, the benefit of the company and the team. But, you know, I guess on my whole program of, you know, 7 countries, I'm actually the only American living in one of the countries sort of leading the program or activity. So actually that's also a little bit of a difference between the NGOs and the development consultancies. Development consultancies typically, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, would have, you know, more of a local staff, more of that, whereas, you know, organizations that have a long-term presence often have a larger expat international staff, which is relevant to people looking for careers overall, if you want to stay overseas in a career.
Yeah. And then I wanted to ask if you see politics play into what you do personally. I know it might be a more broad, you know, Tetra Tech vision or USAID vision, but with what you do day to day, do you see it affecting?
On my approach, yes. I'm in a position where my job is to navigate politics, and I guess my goal is, and I don't know, you know, there's U.S. politics, there's institutional politics. That I'm going to assume we're talking a slight bit more U.S. politics, but you know, I guess my job is to buffer the rest of my team from any politics, because really, I think regardless of what your politics are, everybody wants to help people. They want to see impacts on the ground, and they want to spend money efficiently and effectively. And so what I've found, it's usually just a messaging approach. And I always try to sort of put myself in the shoes of the person in front of me, do a little research, of course. So not just think about it, but understand where they're coming from and change my pitch, whether or not I'm talking to a ag expert, a trophy hunter. I work with trophy hunters and, you know, that side of things. If I'm talking to the Trump administration or the Obama administration, they each come with their own interests, their own funding tied to the issue. And I pivot towards the demands and the perceived demands of the client. And that can be schizophrenic within the client as well. I may have funding right now from Women's Global Development Prosperity Initiative, as well as the Biodiversity Initiative. The people who are talking with the biodiversity funding are just thinking about compliance with a number of sort of biodiversity code issues. The people from the gender initiative are thinking more about this global initiative, that this whole of government initiative. So yeah, I do. But the fortunate thing is I believe in the work that we're doing, both from a property rights perspective. Securing people's property rights is important for tax bases. You can't tax someone unless you know where they are. Most of our education funding comes from taxes, comes from a security of tenure, as I said, about investing in your own land. And clarifying, who owns the trees is, very helpful to forest conservation. So, yeah, I actually think it's a fun part is navigating those different demands.
Yeah.
Infuriating, but it's fun.
Yeah. You mentioned that you are the only American essentially working there, but do you still come across elements of paternalism in your work, and how do you personally navigate that landscape if you do?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, well, it's a little bit, how do you say, interesting. There's a bunch of isms that probably come together at once, whether it's paternalism, colonialism, downright racism, sexism. A lot of pieces can come together when you're working in different cultures, particularly if you're a person in power, or if you perceived power as being a foreigner, representing some form of money or influence. As USAID implementers, we use American economic, technological power to support the rights of communities, protect forests, grow businesses for women and other stakeholders. In some cases, a very recent case in Zambia was our ambassador was kicked out for speaking out on on the protection of rights of a gay couple who was put in jail. That's coming from a Trump administration appointee who was asked to leave by the government because he said you shouldn't, be putting homosexual men in jail. And government said thank you, but no thanks. So I think there's an element there that's maybe, and I don't know if the right word's paternalistic, but saying that our point of view or this point of view is better or worse. Some cases, I'd say some issues around both race and certainly gender issues are, arguably behind in some of the countries where we work in. And I hear things on a daily basis that are stereotypical, misogynistic or whatever, not in a negative way, not in an overtly negative way. And I think you see the same thing about paternalism. It's ingrained in a culture. And so, yeah, it's something that on a daily basis, you have to try to humble yourself. And recognize that we have power and that not we, but, by virtue of being with an organization, and sometimes a brand, you have power. And there's an assumption that we know what's right and that if people just listen to us, things will go better. And that's sort of paternalistic, but that's also the job of a consultant. If I'm a consultant, you've hired me to come in, give my opinion, and then move on. So I think the personal approach that I like to take here is to, use this power, whatever it is, to push for dialogue. It's not our decision. We have opinions about what we like. There's consequences. If a government decides that they don't want to do something, the US government may decide to take aid away. And I've seen that happen a number of times. Not necessarily from a paternalistic perspective, but from a decision-making perspective about, do our interests align? Do these align? And usually it's quite, what would you say? Clear. It's a clear line, and those are never decisions I'm involved in. I'm way down that line. I have to deal with the repercussions of that. Mm-hmm. But as an individual working with government folks, I'd say that the best we can do as an outsider is to protect people who don't have that luxury. Whether you're talking about advocates for civil society rights or land rights or indigenous rights, take the blame or the brunt of any exposure that comes out, and not let the team of local staff feel it, because I have the luxury that, I can be, I guess, evacuated, or or the blame can be put on me and pulled out. I also have that protection with COVID. And then really the goal at the end of the day is push for dialogue and encourage people to talk who wouldn't usually talk. So I can say things in a government meeting or with partners in a more open, direct, but polite way that others can't. We've been able to open up space for people to communicate, whether it's from different political parties who might not usually be able to get together under normal circumstances. And I think that still is a pretty powerful element of, U.S. foreign policy, and the role of, I guess, contractors and projects is creating that space, rather than what I think we've been accused of is, for example, replacing government services. If we go in and deliver a project that delivers water, well, why shouldn't government be doing that already? So it's really about sort of helping to take that first step, but not taking over entirely.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Well, pivoting a little bit, you did mention COVID, but how has the pandemic affected international development so far? And I know you're going back soon, but do you foresee any lasting effects in the sector or in Zambia or sub-Saharan Africa as a whole?
Yeah, it's interesting. Other than, I guess, giving me the option to grow a big beard, which would not usually be the case, and is probably not a long-term impact, although it's been longer than I expected. I'd say, South Africa, the cases are large, or there's a lot of cases. In some of the other countries where I work in, they haven't really taken off. Could be testing, could be otherwise, may still be coming down the pipeline. But, some industries are devastated and way down, and there will be immediate and long-term impacts. Tourism in Southern Africa is non-existent this year. We've seen people move into charcoal, cutting down forests. There's evidence of increased poaching in some places where tourists used to sort of be a detraction. So that void is definitely there. Global travel, could be changing for the foreseeable future, not just for the next few months. So that those impacts could be long-lasting, probably not permanent. But with things like biodiversity, with forests, every year, you can't just rebound. You don't replant primary forest. You don't just wait for the next elephant to be born in a place where, rhinos went extinct in the 1980s in Zambia, the black rhino. So yeah, some industries are definitely affected. COVID has been used as an excuse as well for, I wouldn't say diverting funds, but pushing funds over into other areas, which is all well and good. But yeah, it's definitely a period where we risk losing sight of the other ongoing issues, whether it's, civil war in Yemen or strife in Syria, things I don't really work on, but we have to be able to fight multiple battles at once. And I think that's what we're trying to work on now. It's how to get back to what is that normal.
Mm-hmm. And then as a final question, as an undergrad, how should we be preparing ourselves to enter this field if this is what we want to do? And then also, when recognizing the uncertainty in the job market right now, do you have any tips for how we can set ourselves apart when a lot of in-person meetings or internships aren't available?
Yeah, I guess, as an undergrad, it's just all about getting experiences. And, it doesn't need to be an internship, doesn't need to be, I guess, paid. It makes it harder if it has to be, but saving up and going and installing your place and yourself in an area and putting yourself out there are hugely important to get a foothold. I don't know what things are going to look like in 20 years in this industry. It will certainly be different. The health sector, there's fewer and fewer expats in positions, and they can, rightfully be filled by nationals. There's a big push to fill positions by regional candidates as well. It costs a lot more for folks to fill positions of American expats, frankly. In some other sectors, there may be more positions, for expats. There is a big difference between going into government bureaucracy, whether it's USAID or UN or FAO. Those can be very bureaucratic and sort of plugging away inside an embassy for years. And as the world gets more different and those folks end up staying in capital cities, they can lose touch with what's really happening on the ground. So you really do have to, in an era where you can watch Netflix at home in Osaka, it just changes the nature of connectedness that you have with the people who you're working with and the people you care about. And of course, then some of your beneficiaries are doing that too. I remember the first time I was working with an unemployed farmer in a field, and must have been 2008, and he asked me, was I on Facebook? I said yes, and he sent me a friend request. This is a farmer in the middle of Kenya who was connected. So there are new connection opportunities. But I think as a Middlebury grad, just get out there and go out there and do something. Another piece to realize and remember is that many of the people who you interact with now who may be 5, 10, 15 years older than you, who you can connect with, will soon be in positions of power that it's really useful, and not just useful, but interesting to build on your network and sort of work across and sort of gain access to more influence and power, not in any sort of mischievous way, but in terms of sort of advancing your career. You have to sort of be an owner of your own career. You can't expect that a company or a 5% or a 3% raise a year is going to give you a pathway. You need to own it, use your own network, be willing to jump and move around. And I'd say, at least from my perspective, that was a lot easier in my 20s, my early 20s before I had a family. It's a much bigger decision to be moving and doing things when you're a little bit older. So building that network in your 20s is quite useful, and in an honest way, not sort of in a sneaky way, as long as you really believe and enjoy meeting people and learning, which has been fun from my side. I think the other piece I was trying to mention is that you really should try to have a technical skill that you're comfortable in, whether it's GIS, economic modeling, or something else that you learn and are passionate about, because you may only get to do it in your 20s. I think my biggest disappointment is that as I've advanced in my career, I have less time to do the things I'm actually good at and that I was trained in. I spend more time on management and telling other people to do things that I'm good at. That might just be my role from a management position and just a personal regret, but I think that a lot of times as you advance, you still maintain that consideration. I can still consider myself an ecologist because of Andy Lloyd's classes at Middlebury and a few other folks who were really impactful professors. But at the end of the day, nobody knows that with who I work with. And I guess the other thing is, with things changing, consider working for the private sector, even in international development. I think I've seen a lot of Middlebury graduates go and work internationally for the private sector, but from a service delivery perspective, because the development role, as we're talking about, needs to work itself out of a business, and it can get tiring trying to work yourself out of a business for a long time. But if you're in the private sector, your job's to continually get better, and that's a really sort of motivating factor, or can be.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us and for talking to me today. I know I've appreciated hearing what you have to say, and hopefully your remarks will also help other young students like me think about what they want to do in the international development field and such like that. And thank you everyone else for watching, and also keep an eye out for future episodes in this and other career conversations. We hope everyone's staying safe and healthy. Thanks again, Matt.
Cool. Thank you.